for the IARPC Coastal Resilience team. And Colleen Strawhacker is also on the phone. She's the other co-lead. Colleen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Colleen Strawhacker, Program Officer at the National Science Foundation. I'm keeping my camera off today because I'm dealing with day 2 Moderna shot 2 side effects. So just listening in for now, but happy with my new antibodies. Thanks, John.
All right, hang in there, Colleen. Thanks for joining. I just wanted to have a few introductions myself as well. And so first, I just wanted to let folks know that are new to IARPC to this call, just more about what our IARPC is. It's the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and it maintains this really great web page that we're using now to collaborate and communicate about Arctic activities and research. There's over 2,500 members currently, and that grows every week. I think our web guru said in a meeting recently, there's 9 or 10 people that join every week. So it's a great platform to find information and post updates and learn more about Arctic activities, Arctic research activities and collaboration activities among all of these different participants. Also, IARPC writes a 5-year Arctic research plan, and it's a place where federal agencies can come together and coordinate their activities and also focus on issues that are important to Arctic residents and partners outside the federal government. And so we're currently at the end of the current 5-year plan that expires the end of this year. And there is a new plan, draft plan available for public comment. And there are links on the IARPC site of where you can participate in public comments through June 11th. There's a Federal Register notice, there's a web link, there's a phone number where you can call and leave a voicemail. There's an address for hard copy comments. Hazel, am I missing anything on that?
That sounds right. I will drop a link to the IARPC website where you can learn more and find links for all of those different places to comment. Okay, great.
And then a little bit about this team. There are a number of different collaboration teams within IARPC that are focusing on different topics. The Coastal Resilience Collaboration Team is working to advance our understanding and work on priorities for coastal resilience of ecosystems in different regions of the Arctic. And that those ecosystems include people, natural, and built environments. And so today we really wanted to focus on a topic that deals with coastal species. That's one of the priorities that we focus on as part of this team. And so I've invited Karyn Rode with the US Geological Survey and Lori Quakenbush with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game today to talk about a study that they worked on with a number of other collaborators that does deal with shifts in coastal species and habitats. And as I mentioned, that's one of our top interests with this collaboration team. And the study is really unique in that it involves hunter-collected information across Alaska on seals, and Lori's going to talk some about that. And then it also deals with information from sea ice and atmospheric conditions. And so we've invited team members from other collaboration teams in IARPC that deal with these topics because we thought that you all would be interested in this study. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Karyn Rode and Lori Quakenbush for their presentation. If anyone's having any difficulty hearing or seeing the slides that Karyn is going to share, just feel free to raise your hand or post a comment in the chat and we'll see what we can do.
Great. Thanks, John. Let me just get my share screen set up. All right. Thanks so much for being here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with your group about this this study. I haven't been involved with IARPC, so I really appreciate, John, you alerting me to this group and giving me this opportunity to talk about this collaborative project. So I guess one question I had, I know that we wanted these presentations to be, interactive. So John, is there a way maybe that like if someone has questions as I go in the chat that you could, kind of interrupt me and make sure I kind of answer any questions as we go? Would that work?
Yeah, we'll monitor the chat and I can also watch for people that might raise their hand and we can interrupt you if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's definitely do. So put any questions you have as we go. So don't hesitate if there's some background or something I haven't provided that would be useful as I talk through this project. Put those in the chat and then that way I can be addressing them as we go. And then per the suggestion of the group, I have set this up just to be pretty broad overview of this study. And then to end with some suggested discussion questions, but also looking forward to input from everyone that's here.
Yes.
So this is a project that is a collaborative project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who we've worked with for 10 years to collect data on polar bears in the Chukchi Sea. And also with Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Lori Quakenbush is here, and Justin Crawford is also here. And they have worked closely with Alaska Natives on a long-term program collecting data on seals from the harvest. That was really, it was absolutely critical component of this particular project. So a big part of what this project was to bring together these multiple data sources. And so Lori's going to speak more to that program, but the data that was provided from those harvests by hunters is absolutely critical to this project. So I want to acknowledge that. We also worked with Eric Regier at the University of Washington, and he was formerly with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS, so he's also a partner on this project. See if it'll advance here. There you go. Okay. So in 2008, so a little bit about kind of my background is I originally worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from 2006 to 2012, and then came over and have been working with the USGS Alaska Science Center since then. And while at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we started a research program in the Chukchi Sea in 2008. And that was in response to a variety of information needs because there hadn't been much study at all of the polar bear population that ranges in the Chukchi Sea between the northwest coast of Alaska and Russia since the late 1990s. And back in 2008, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was considering a petition to list polar bears under the Endangered Species Act. There was also oil and gas activity in the Chukchi Sea, and they were starting to implement a treaty with Russia to co-manage polar bears. So it was really apparent at the time that that was an information gap, that we just knew nothing about the status of this population and that there had been really dramatic changes in sea ice conditions and how that population responded was unknown. So the primary objectives of the project when we started in 2008 was to see if there was a way we could collect data that would estimate the size and the status of the population, but also recognizing the need to identify ecological or environmental drivers of population dynamics, knowing that things are changing really quick, trying to get at the heart of, what creates a healthy polar bear population in this area. Because if we can identify that, we're going to better understand how changes that are occurring could affect the population. So the primary methodology was a capture-based study. So every year, let's see, let me move this bar so you can see. Can you see the all the pictures okay? Let me get rid of this here. There.
Yep.
So all the captures were, most of the captures were based out of Red Dog Mine. They have a port site that's between Point Hope and Kotzebue on the northwest coast of Alaska. So in 8 years out of a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017, we took a helicopter out onto the sea ice and captured somewhere between 50 and 100 bears a year. And bears were marked, they were given individual IDs in an attempt to use a recapture based methodology for estimating population size and vital rates. But it also gave us an opportunity to handle these animals and assess their condition and collect samples that allow us to estimate their diet, look at their health, determine whether they fed recently. And so in this picture here, we're actually using a bioelectrical and impedance analysis, which allows you to estimate the body fat of bears. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how important body condition is, particularly for bears in affecting reproduction. So also in handling bears, we can get information on the numbers of cubs per female and the condition of those cubs. And we know that the condition of a cub is directly related to their survival. So one of the challenges in trying to figure out ways to monitor polar bear populations is that it's difficult to get population size and vital rate estimates. And this is particularly true in the Chukchi Sea because that population has a huge range. It ranges all the way to Russia and back. And our recapture rates were pretty low. So we were not getting very many repeat samples, which makes it difficult to estimate population size with a marker capture methodology. For several decades, there's been discussion about trying to get an aerial survey based approach for the Chukchi Sea, and that has been done and for polar bear populations in other part of the Arctic. But the bottom line is that most population estimates for polar bears, with the exception of a few populations, are very difficult to get. You get them infrequently and they have large confidence intervals. So they're not really the ideal information to use to monitor the status of a population because your chances of getting repeated estimates that don't overlap to really understand how a population is doing is difficult. So there's really a need for key indicators that aid in monitoring polar bear populations. Answering this question of what supports a healthy polar bear population. So for bears, including polar bears, the accumulation of body reserves is critical in supporting reproduction in females. So in polar bears, only pregnant females den. And during that time, of course, they're not eating. So they enter the dens in approximately November and they're coming out in April. So during that time, whatever condition they're in when they go in the den has to support their own body reserve so that they survive, but also to produce a cub and lactate until they can get back on the ice and access to seals again. So this figure on the right here is data from an individual female in the Southern Beaufort Sea, just as an example to I wanted to show you how much their body condition of a female varies based on their reproductive status. So she was tracked and caught numerous times in the Beaufort Sea, and this is her body mass is in pounds instead of kilograms. And all of these low mass values are years that she was observed with first year cubs. And this is in the springtime. So those are times when she had just come out of the den and she had cubs. So she hadn't, eaten throughout the winter. And the first time I started looking at some of these data, I knew there'd be variation, but I don't think I really was surprised at how much variation there is for an individual female based on reproductive status. So in years when she hadn't had a first year cub, she could be almost twice the body mass of when she had a first year cub. So that means that in order to have cubs again, she has to put on a dramatic amount of body mass in order to be able to support that reproduction. So just emphasizing that female condition is a really good metric because it has direct links to population dynamics. And body condition of females and also the numbers of cubs the numbers of cubs and juveniles in a population are also really useful metrics because they're the most sensitive to environmental change. So environmental change is much less likely to affect, for example, adult survival than it is juvenile survival and reproduction. So if you can find things that tell you about the condition of females and the numbers of cubs in the population, you have a pretty good pulse on the primary factors that are probably affecting the population dynamics. So in this study, we had between 2008 and 2017, we collected data for 8 years on the body condition and recruitment indices. We were able to collect the samples that I mentioned that allowed us to estimate what the diets were of bears in the population. And also we were able to look at some blood chemistry parameters that would tell us whether or not they had fed recently. So in the springtime when we're capturing them, what was their access to food like during that time period? And so we then looked at these variables. These are the dependent variables. And we looked at several factors to see how they might be related to body condition recruitment, including prey. So one of the big challenges for polar bears is that a lot of studies have been able to look at the effects of sea ice changes because we can get those data from satellite. But the really hard piece of the puzzle to get at is the importance of prey and the availability of prey and how that fits into affecting polar bears. And that's why the data that Lori and Justin were able to coordinate to collection of and provide for this project were really critical. So we were able to look at an index of prey availability, which was ring seal, bearded seal, and body condition. We had ice data from satellites. And then we also looked at a climatic index that has been shown to be important for polar bears in many parts of the Arctic, which is the Winter Arctic Oscillation Index. It's not very clear how the mechanistic role that that index plays in affecting polar bears, but it's been linked to their predation rates, has been linked to body condition and recruitment in other studies. So we also looked at that here to see what role it might be playing in affecting Chukchi Sea polar bears. And then we controlled for other covariates that were important in our analyses, things like age class and how age class, sex, capture date, the reproductive state would affect a bear's body condition, for example. So Lori's gonna tell you more about the seal data that we used in this project.
Thanks, Karyn. So at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, we've been collecting seal information because, as Karyn told you, how difficult it is to assess abundance and population trends for polar bears. It's very similar for ice seals. We've got seals on the Russian side of the Bering Sea and the Chukchi side and the Russian side of the Chukchi Sea, and we can mostly only survey the US side. So NOAA's been trying to get population abundance estimates. They're currently flying in the Beaufort Sea today. But as Karyn said, population trend is really hard when your abundance estimates aren't that precise, and the number of surveys that can be flown aren't really going to get you population trend information. So what we've tried to do is monitor the health and status of the populations through indices to population health. And we've done that by working with Alaska Native subsistence hunters and they're collecting samples from their harvest. And if you see the map, there's 11 villages on the map, and those 11 villages all contributed to the data set that we used in this study. And hunters are amazing partners in this type of research because they're very interested in the seals. They're very interested in the health of the animals because they depend on them for their food and other materials. So we have great participation in this study because of that, and great interest in the research. So the samples that we collect include physical measurements for body condition. As Karyn was saying, in this study we use blubber thickness collected at the sternum, so right in the middle of the chest between the front flippers. You can put a knife there and go down to bone, and it gives a really good measurement that can be reproduced. We also get length measurements, teeth that we can get age of the seal. We collect stomachs for diet analysis, and then female reproductive tracts give us a lot of information about pregnancy rate, age at maturity, excuse me, that sort of thing. So I think next slide, Karyn. So if we take our sternal blubber thickness as an index of seal health, we look at the mean thickness for a given year relative to the average across all years, we can get a sense of whether seals are in better or worse condition each year. Seals vary in their blubber thickness by season. The fattest seals are in the winter under the ice, which isn't necessarily intuitive, but their blubber is thickest in the winter months and thinner in the spring and summer. And so the model accounts for that, for the seasonality of the blubber thickness, and also for seal age. Pups have sort of a different pattern of their when they put on their blubber than the non-pups do. So by using these data, we can look at years when seals were above the 0 line, which is average, and when body condition was below the 0 line, which is average. And so that gives us an index of good years and bad years. And for this data set, we ended up using ring seals that were harvested the fall before the spring bear captures. And for bearded seals, it was the spring in which the bears were captured. And I think that's all I've Scott. It's back to Karyn.
Thanks, Lori. So these are the metrics that we ended up putting into models, and those dependent variables I listed, we had models for each of those things. So for example, we had a metric of whether bears had fed or not. And then we could put in the model these ice metric or these seal metrics, and then also various ice metrics of things that we know are important to polar bears about ice. And then the Arctic oscillation and some of these other covariates. So I didn't want to go through any of the details of the modeling. I just, I thought I would just review at a really broad scale what the findings and kind of ultimate result from those models were. So we know ring seals are important to polar bears. You know, they're most abundant seal throughout the Arctic. But here we were able to actually use these metrics that Justin and Lori have been coordinating collection of these residual condition measures of seals and directly relate that to various aspects of polar bear feeding ecology and body condition. So adult females and subadults are we found were the most reliant on ring seals. Over 50% of their diets were ring seals. And the probability that adult females or subadults have fed recently in the springtime was directly related to these condition measures of ring seals. And in addition, the ring seal body condition was also directly related to female polar bear body condition. And so I have a direct correlation relationship shown here in this middle figure between ring seal body condition measure and the female polar bear body condition measure. And that direct correlation isn't significant. I just put this on here to show the relationship, general relationship between the two. But when you put that in a model and you control for these other factors like the age of a bear, when they were captured within a field season, ring seal body condition came up again and again as being important to these particular sex and age classes. But interestingly, there was a confounding relationship between ring seal body condition and ice. And both ring seals, the body condition of ring seals and the condition of females was inversely related to how much ice there was in June to November. So, so when there's more sea ice during that time period over the Chukchi Sea continental shelf, ring seal body condition was lower, which corresponded with lower polar bear body condition. And that seals seem to do better when there's less sea ice in the summer is something that's been seen previously in some of Justin's work in the Chukchi Sea. But also there's been some hints of that in the Beaufort Sea as well. So there's this kind of complex relationship between ice, polar bear prey, and polar bears. But ultimately, however the prey are doing is the most important, one of the most important factors for polar bears. Adult males relied more on larger prey than adult females. So winter spring diets of adult males were 40% bearded seal and 20% beluga whale. And as a result, their body condition is more closely linked to the prey that are important to them. So they show better body condition during years when bearded seal had better body condition. So you have these two components of the population that are potentially responding to different things in the ecosystem. So if you have something that's changing that's affecting bearded seal, but's not affecting ring seal, you're more likely to have impacts on adult males than you are other segments of the population. And that can be particularly important when you start considering what factors you look at a population level, that not all factors are important to all components of the population. The winter Arctic oscillation showed to be particularly important for a number of indices that we looked at that represent recruitment. So how many cubs are females producing and how many of are surviving to be juveniles. So then, for example, the number of yearlings per female is inversely related to the winter Arctic oscillation. And this relationship, as I mentioned, has been shown elsewhere in the Arctic. And this specific relationship between recruitment and the winter Arctic oscillation has been shown in Svalbard, for example, in the Barents Sea. So there's something going on here. We don't fully understand it, what the mechanism is, but this particular index is an important indicator of recruitment for polar bears. So from this 10-year study, some of our conclusions are that the status of prey populations is really important for polar bears. So trying to manage or consider the status of polar bear populations based on ice alone is unlikely to be anywhere near as informative as if you can monitor prey populations. And how prey populations are doing can either compound or mitigate polar bear responses to sea ice loss. So obviously polar bears have to have some sea ice to be able to access their prey. So they can't have unlimited loss of sea ice. But what the status of the prey populations is an additional factor that's going to determine how they fare when there's sea ice loss occurring. Seal body condition is a useful indicator of prey biomass. It's available to polar bears and is directly related to their condition. And that is really useful because, some of these harvest monitoring program for seals that Justin and Lori coordinate, is easier than having the funding and the resources and even logistically being able to continually capture polar bears to monitor their health directly. The winter Arctic oscillation seems like it detects ecological and environmental conditions that are important to bears that aren't being measured in these sea ice and prey metrics that we used. But again, the exact mechanisms of that are not known. So capture-based polar bear studies of polar bears are becoming increasingly difficult because of sea ice loss. So these are figures of sea ice conditions in the Chukchi Sea on April 16th between 2016 and 2018. And that's the time frame that we, sorry about that. This is the time frame when we do our annual capture efforts. So we go out between mid-March and the end of April. And in 2016, this ice is relatively typical of what it would look like when we would go out to collect data on polar bears. But then in 2017, there's a lot of open water and it's getting really broken up. So we did actually get out to capture bears in 2017, but we had to end the field season 2 weeks early. And by 2018, the ice was so broken up even at the beginning of the timing of our field season that we had to cancel it altogether. And the same thing happened in 2019. We also had to cancel the season because of lack of ice. So it's becoming increasingly important to figure out how polar bears are going to continue to be monitored in the absence of some of this direct data. And the changes are still, pretty dramatic in the Arctic, including in the Chukchi Sea. So the Chukchi Sea saw a substantial decline in summer sea ice between the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. But more recently, the change that seems to be occurring is in spring sea ice. So during our study, spring sea ice declined 2% per year. And so this figure here shows the mean ice cover over the Chukchi Bering Sea shelf from March through May between, I think it's about 1985 till 2019. And you can see in recent years, this dramatic decline in spring sea ice, reaching levels that have never occurred in the satellite record. So things continue to change. So this paper is in press at Global Change Biology. And it just came out recently. So we're just starting to talk about it and we're looking forward to circling back to some of the communities that provided the key data to do this work. So with that, I had a couple of questions. I'll just leave them on the slide of things that I was interested in perspectives of from the group, but would be happy to answer questions or entertain other topics of discussion. And one last thing I wanted to mention is that in terms of the need for continued monitoring of polar bears on the Chukchi Sea, here's a picture here. This is the US-Russia Polar Bear Commission. So there is a treaty to manage polar bears in the Chukchi Sea, and every year they meet to discuss harvest and conservation of that population. And so there is a need for continual information about polar bears in this region.
Great. Thank you, Karyn and Lori. And thanks so much for putting questions up on the screen there for the group. I think that's a great idea. So we could start there, Karyn, and then feel free others to ask different questions if you have them or post them in the chat box. But why don't we just start with question number 1, Karyn, if you would like to read that off maybe?
Yeah. So, thinking, I think we're thinking about next steps for this population, in the absence of, being able to continually get population estimates and potentially to keep monitoring even through capture-based work. We've considered whether the winter AO or sea ice conditions or body condition of seals might be a way to track indicators of recruitment and condition for the population for monitoring. Every year the US-Russia Commission asks, is there any new information about polar bears in this region that we should use to make decisions? And so, one thing that I've discussed with several colleagues is, should we be trying to estimate from some of these relationships what we think recruitment or body condition of polar bears may be as an indicator for change when it's not possible to collect new information? Perhaps, I don't know, Jester or Lori, if you want to talk about kind of for seal harvest monitoring, is that going to be able to continue?
That's a really good question. The project has mostly been funded by NOAA, and they've been pretty consistent in funding it. Funding's always sort of a problem for us. We never quite know. We can't plan too far ahead. But we do have data back to the 1960s, and we have been, since about 2000, we have pretty, or 2000, 2002, we have pretty good data straight through. So not a whole lot of gaps in it in recent years, but this is not something the state of Alaska funds. It is funded by NOAA, so that their budget, is never known that well very far in advance. So we hope so. We'll definitely pursue funding and try to continue it. We definitely have the participation from the hunters. They're very interested in this project and they participate at a really high level. So there's no problem from that perspective. It's mostly just being able to fund it in general.
I just noticed some questions in the chat too that I can answer. One is, has the polar bear population migrated to more favorable locations? And if so, should monitoring follow the population? So this population seems to be staying put within the Chukchi Sea. So far, their movements are more northern than they were previously. That's a really good question because in some places that we are seeing those types of changes. I think in the Beaufort Sea, you're starting to see bears actually come to the Chukchi Sea, and there's been some discussion of studies to try to look at whether that's increasing, whether there's more bears coming from the Beaufort. But right now, I think this population's been staying in the Chukchi Sea. It's just a little further northward. The challenge is access to the population because you either have the Russian coast, Wrangel Island, or the Northwest Alaska coast to access the population. And so when it's moving further north, it's further from shore, which makes it difficult to access the bears.
And Karyn, I might suggest that you stop sharing your screen and folks can go into gallery view.
Sure, thanks.
And Janet did put another question in the chat. What source of ice data do you use?
Oh, and thanks, Hazel, for putting the questions in the chat. That was the only reason I was keeping slides up. Yeah, okay, what source of ice data did you use? It was just ice concentration data from, I have to look, it's the national, I'd have to look at the paper to see the exact source, but it was concentration data, and we were looking at ice availability over the shelf, typically as like the amount of area covered by the concentration of ice that's typically used by polar bears. Yeah, National Snow and Ice Data Center. Yeah, National Snow and Ice Data Center.
I think I see a seal question for me.
Yeah.
Good question. I'll read it. It looked like ring seal condition was very low for a few years around 2010 to 12. UME question mark. UME stands for unusual mortality event. And then I'll keep reading. Since then, condition improved. So do you think the increasing trend in ring seal condition over the past decade primarily reflects a recovery from the 2010 low? We saw a signal in our data, not just for the blubber thickness, but also for ring seal productivity, pregnancy rate, and some other things. And the UME, the unusual mortality event, was thought to be 2011. And for ring seals, we think we saw it beginning in 2010, definitely in 2011. And things improved a lot in 2012. So even though it was a pretty large mortality event for ring seals, we saw less of a signal for bearded seals. And it pretty much bounced back in 2012 to about average. So I don't think we would interpret the data right now for saying that there's a continued increase, but basically the recovery was pretty quick after the UME. And there's currently another UME that is in progress right now from animals that were found dead on the beach a year ago. And we are not seeing the same signal with this current UME that we saw with the last one. So it's a different, whatever the problem is, it's a different problem. The symptoms aren't the same or anything, but we're actually not seeing the signal in our data that we did with the 2011 UME. Good question, Dave.
And then Karyn, I wouldn't mind asking a question if I can.
Sure.
Goes with your second question there. Are there other environmental or ecological factors to consider or interactions with other species? And along with that, sort of what's the future plan? I think I've talked to both of you about this, but since, you know, the AO and seal body condition could be really useful for not only understanding seal body condition going forward, but also the status of the subpopulation of the Chukchi Sea polar bear. You know, is that a plan? Can that be done on an annual basis with AO data, the oscillation data and seal data? Or would other information from these other factors you mentioned in your question be helpful for that too?
I mean, I think it's possible. I think it's possible to look at, you know, if that's part of the reason, you know, asking Lori about continued seal monitoring program. I mean, that seems pretty critical to continued monitoring of the polar bear population, is to continue to, you know, find support for the seal monitoring. And AO data are available every year. So, I mean, I think it is possible to get an idea, you know, certainly if you saw like a really positive AO year, or things that are getting much higher than what they've been, or you see that for a period of multiple years, you know, you may not be able to say exactly what the recruitment would be, but you would, you know that, you know, if you saw really high AO years and then seal condition kind of, you know, go really down, in combination with, you know, large areas of sea ice loss, then I think you would have more concern and maybe manage the population more cautiously. So there's sort of a general way to try to do that. And then you could actually try to estimate numbers for some of those values. I'm curious, you know, for our group, if, you know, other people have faced limitations because of changes in the Arctic on their ability to collect data. I understand there were some multiple talks potentially about that at a Wildlife Society meeting recently, that, you know, because this is going to be a significant issue for polar bears in terms of conditions changing to the point that it's difficult to continue monitoring populations and collecting data.
I can answer for the seal data. We have been able to, even with COVID, the hunters we've been doing this for a while, and so everybody's sort of used to the system. And even though we haven't been able to get out to the villages in the last year or so, we've still had a lot of samples coming in. So hunters are still willing to collect them, and the seal availability still seems to be fairly good. There's places where the season is much shorter and hunters have to really work to get the seals. But in many places, they're able to get out and get seals and send the samples in. So we're pretty happy about how well we've been able to keep up on the sampling, given all of the things with COVID and with changing ice so far.
Any information from the hunting community about other observations they have or other sort of components that they think would be useful to incorporate?
Useful to incorporate into our sampling program?
Yeah, or under seal body condition, I guess.
Well, we talk a lot about those things, and we definitely incorporate suggestions. There's, other than measuring seal girth, which isn't something that we've done very much. It's really hard to do with bearded seals because you can't just roll them over and handle them very well. So that's not something that we've been able to get very reliably. But length and age is another metric that we use. It wasn't presented here at all, but seals grow really rapidly in their first year. And so we can also look at, we can get seals harvested in a year, identify their age by tooth, back calculate to the age they were born, and we can get a sense of above average and below average years in that way too, and go back in time. So that's another metric that we can look at for looking at good years and bad years of growth, basically when nutrition and conditions are good. So we have some other ways to look at that. And then pregnancy rate tracks pretty well too. Pregnancy rate can be lower in tough years and higher, and then age at maturity. So if conditions are really good, the females are maturing at younger age, and we track that. So we have multiple metrics that or indices that we look at for that.
Okay.
There's another question in the chat too. The strength of an AO is highly correlated with sea ice drift and export through winds. Is there an additional index that you might be more related to the Chukchi Sea area that you could need, perhaps a more regional wind related index? So we did do a study with some of the data that was in this particular study, which is the feeding data. So we have this blood chemistry metric that gives us an idea of whether bears fed in the past 7 to 10 days. And we did a study that used wind data. Dave Douglas on the call. What was the wind? Where was the wind data from in that study? The spatially explicit.
Wind data was probably from either the NCEP or the North American Regional Reanalysis or the European Reanalysis. One of the global reanalyses data sets, but I'd have to look back at the paper to see which one we actually used. But they're pretty coarse resolution, but they're every day, if not even several times a day. And it probably would have been the near surface 10-meter winds.
And so we did find relationships with wind, and we also used scatterometry data. And essentially the way it seemed to come out was that dynamic ice conditions may be good for polar bears, which sort of makes sense, like opening of new leads and opening of the ice. So that's not really compact. And in this particular study, we had been comparing the Beaufort and the Chukchi, which, sometimes the Beaufort can be really sealed up. And so that dynamic ice conditions that may be associated with wind was a good thing for bears. But, in this study, we had to have an annual metric. And so I'd have to put some more thought into what we could have as an annual metric that might, be more mechanistically related to what's affecting polar bears, presumably through their access to food, to prey. And so I would certainly be open to ideas. One thing that we had talked about, there's been so many studies that have shown relationships with the AO, and we really don't understand that, was trying to work more closely with people who are studying the AO and how it affects the environment. That might help us better understand what some of those mechanisms are that's actually resulting in effects on polar bears. So thanks for those questions. So another question is, as we learn more about polar bear energetics, do you foresee a good way to integrate information about polar bear energetics into recruitment condition of Chukchi Sea polar bears without continuous monitoring? And would that change how we model relationships between predator prey? So we are working on some energetics work now, and along exactly this line of trying to think, what's something we could do with existing data to kind of understand how things are going to play out for polar bears as sea ice conditions continue to change. But that particular model, that particular work we're doing right now is really focused on land use. So we know also that polar bears in the Chukchi Sea increasingly spend time on land, and increasing proportions of polar bears in the Chukchi Sea are coming on land in the summer months, and that's directly related to the sea ice conditions. And so projecting forward, they're going to likely be spending more time on land, and potentially more bears are going to spend summer on land. And so one thing we're working on is projecting forward in time, what that might look like for Chukchi Sea polar bears, how many bears could come on shore depending on future ice conditions, and how long might they spend there. And then looking at the potential energetic effects of that change, but not as much on what's happening on the ice and how energetics might be changing on the ice. So we don't, and maybe there's a way with existing data to try to start piecing that together. Let's see, it's another question. Following Janet's comments, this also should be correlated to increasing cyclonic activity in the Arctic. As the polar bear front migrates northward, sea ice depends also of radiative cooling, which is reduced by cyclonic activity. Oh, okay. Thanks for that additional thought.
Any other questions or thoughts? Thanks so much for the great discussion, everyone. Janet's got another comment there.
Yeah. So the comment is, there's an index that relates Aleutian low and Beaufort high that might be of interest. Okay. Yeah. So more regionally specific indices. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I also wanted to give folks time if they just want to provide general updates to the group. But feel free to keep posting questions and we can go back to those. We still have about 10 minutes. But if I can, maybe I'll start with Colleen Strawhacker. I know she has an update and maybe some other updates that she wants to share.
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks to Karyn and Lori. This has been an interesting conversation, especially for me as a social scientist. It's always really good to see kind of, the science that's going on outside of my world. And I really appreciated the conversation. So thanks for joining us today. I do have one announcement. Yesterday, the National Science Foundation released the Dear Colleague letter, which I've pasted into the chat. As many of you know, we've those of us in the Arctic Sciences section and Navigating the New Arctic have been, having these extended conversations with the science community and with Indigenous peoples in the Arctic about kind of how we can make the NSF merit review process and funding opportunities more inclusive of Indigenous voices. So this Dear Colleague letter provides a quick, an extensive update on some of the activities we've been up to, just trying to improve our work in that space. So I just wanted to highlight that for you all. Feel free to take a look. And that also highlights a new website, nsf.gov/ACE, which provides a lot of resources too. Another update that I wanted to provide is that I'm a co-lead on the diversity and inclusion team for IARPC. My other one of my other co-leads, Olivia Lee, is on too. And we are really starting to ramp up again now that, the new administration, one of their pillars is really focused on diversity and inclusion. So we just wanted to kind of highlight that we are around. We're doing lots of interesting things. We've kicked off a reading group, and we call it a reading group, but it's more just talking about interesting things. So we're talking about kind of podcasts we can listen to and then come together and discuss. So I just wanted to highlight that please feel free to join us. Please feel free to send us any recommendations on topics that you think would be of interest for your teams and for your work. I've pasted a link to our team there. Olivia, as a co-lead, do you have anything to add from your perspective on diversity and inclusion?
No, I just do want to welcome everyone to participate in the discussion. I think that a lot of people don't know if they have a role in these kinds of groups, but everyone should feel welcome to join.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, our last conversation was on allyship in science, and it was really compelling. And I think it was, we really wanted to kind of continue on the conversation in future topics. So again, feel free to send along, join us and send along any suggestions of topics you think would be of interest. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you, John, for giving me a couple of minutes. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other updates from the group? Okay, well, if you have other updates you want to share, there's a way to do that on the IARPC page. Just click the update button and you can add anything there that you'd like to, as far as research updates or other updates that you want to share with the group. We don't have a plan, I don't think, Colleen, for our next month collaboration team meeting, but we'll get that put together shortly and send that out. Anything else we should talk about, Colleen or Hazel?
Nothing that comes to my mind.
Nope, that sounds great. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all for joining.
And thanks, Lori and Karyn. That was really interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.